This happened when I was 12, and my brother was 17, and is truly proof that the living are far more terrifying than the dead. I think about this every Halloween, actually. This is not a paranormal story, by the way. The community I grew up in was made up of mostly Hispanic people, so the folklore of La Llorona was very popular in the area, especially around Halloween. For those of you who don't know the myth of La Llorona, it's basically a story about a woman who married a rich man, had a perfect life, but then the man cheated on her. She was so distraught that she took her children to the river and drowned them. When she realized what she had done, she threw herself in the river and drowned herself as well. But she couldn't pass on to the afterlife without her children, so she roams the river forever looking in search for her kids. If she spots living children, she'll grab them and drown them to take them to the afterlife with her. This story is meant to keep kids from playing in the river. Most of my friends that year were too cool and grown up to go trick-or-treating, and were planning on having a party instead. I was really disappointed, and asked my brother if he would take me trick-or-treating with him. He agreed, and we went while it was still light outside, so I would be able to make it to the party before the end of the night. Since we had gone out too early though, there weren't a lot of people actually ready to hand out candy, so after quite a disappointing trek, we started walking back home. On our way home, we passed by a park that had a river running next to it. On Halloween, older teens would usually wait at this park to try and see if they could get a glimpse of La Llorona. Waiting to spot her at this particular spot was a well-known town tradition that people had done for decades, and still continues even to this day. However, there were no kids or teens there yet because it was still kind of early. There were people in the park putting on a Llorona play, though. We decided to stop and watch it. There wasn't really much of an audience. It seemed like it was just us and a few other kids who were a part of the group putting on the play. They weren't in costumes and didn't have trick-or-treating buckets with them. When we sat down, a woman approached us and asked us if we were trick-or-treating. I told her we were, and she dropped a small comic book in my trick-or-treat bag and smiled. She seemed very kind and welcoming. The play started, and I got the weird feeling that something was off, though. The woman playing La Llorona pointed my brother and me out in the tiny audience and asked us immediately what religion we were. My brother responded, "Roman Catholic." She then told us that La Llorona was also a Roman Catholic and was burning in hell for her sins and for rejecting Jesus. She then told us that Halloween was an evil holiday, and everyone who celebrated would burn forever. As the play progressed, it started getting weirder and weirder, including scenes where La Llorona started talking about abortion and held up a fake fetus and pretended to eat it. My brother and I started to get up to leave, but the people stopped us and started yelling at us to sit down. We kept going, though. They started to follow us down the street. My brother grabbed my hand and started running because he was afraid they were going to harm us. We finally got to our street, and only about 3 people were still following us, yelling about how we were going to go to hell and we needed to accept Jesus right now. My brother and I went inside quickly, and he locked the front doors, then frantically ran around the house making sure all the doors and windows were locked before he called our dad at his office. Our dad told us to call the police and that he'd be home in 15 minutes. When my dad got home, the people were still outside, chanting and singing some prayer song, asking God to save my brother's and my soul. My dad shooed them away and told them the police would be there any second. They weren't deterred, though. They stayed there chanting until the police showed up and threatened to arrest them. I was so freaked out by the events, I decided I didn't want to go to that party after all. Instead, I just wanted to organize my Halloween candy and put aside all the Snickers for my brother as a thank you for taking me with him. Snickers were his favorite. My mom ordered pizza, and we all sat down to watch Halloween Town while I went through my trick-or-treat bag. I was halfway through sorting my candy when I came across the comic book that the lady had dropped in there. I opened it up, and it truly horrified me. It was a propaganda comic about a little boy who went to a haunted house, ended up being hit by a car on the way home, and went to hell because he never found Jesus. I was really scared, and for weeks as a child, I had nightmares about the event and the comic book. Years later, I asked my mom if she remembered it, and she told me that she could never forget. She and my father had called the police over it several times. Apparently, for years, the group would leave envelopes with mine and my brother's names written on them, with different weird, creepy comic books and handwritten notes about how they were always praying for us. Always invitations to join them in their church, and weird promises about baking us cakes, and other creepy ways to entice our child selves into their church. To this day, we still can't figure out how they discovered our names, or who wrote the letters. It really creeps me out that they did this, though. I told a friend one time about the comic, and he knew exactly what they were. I ended up Googling it, and finding that exact comic online. If you want to see what was given to me, you can view it here. So, I think the title says it all. Here's what happened. We were on a family holiday abroad years ago. I think I was 14 at the time. My sister was 16 at the time, and the toddler was our cousin. She was maybe about 2 years old, perhaps a little bit older. So we headed out during the evening to have dinner, and just after that, we'd walk through the towns and maybe stop at a few bars for drinks. As we were walking through this particular town, a man who was, I'll say, badly dressed as a clown, approached my sister. Bear in mind, my sister is deathly afraid of clowns, no matter how good or badly dressed they are. She was carrying our cousin on her hip, and the clown looked at our cousin. He said hello to her, making her laugh, as clowns tend to do. My sister, on the other hand, just froze. I was standing by watching this happening, kind of laughing at the fact that my sister was crapping herself. I was a pretty savage sister after all. The next thing though, without asking or even saying anything, he grabbed my cousin from my sister. Of course, I thought, "Whoa, hey, what are you doing?" I shouted over to my parents and my aunt and uncle. My dad rushed over. "Hey, what do you think you're doing with my niece?" He was trying to get her back out of the man's arms, but when he tried to grab her, the clown would just turn away and push my dad back. "I thought you would like to take a photo. Do you not want to take a photo?" My aunt came over as well. She was scared out of her mind, thinking that clowns were suddenly trying to kidnap her daughter. We all just gathered around the clown, trying to pry my cousin from his arms, but every time he would just pull away and push us back. Next thing I know, my dad had had enough. He approached the clown and said, "Let go of my niece right now." He grabbed the clown by his neck. In the end, he put her down. My dad picked her up and handed her to his sister-in-law. The clown just casually said, "Oh, okay. Too bad. I guess you don't want to take a photo," and handed my cousin a lollipop. We just headed back to the hotel and kind of tried to brush it off, but the next day, we saw him again as we were at a restaurant. This time, he took someone else's kid away from the parents into some room. My dad spotted him as he came out of the toilets and stopped him, thinking he'd grabbed my cousin again, but it was someone else. He headed back to the table and ate his dinner, but for a second, he felt something wasn't right, so he went back to the clown's room. I don't know what went down when he went back, but he came back out holding the other kid's hand and asked her where her parents were, assuming they were in the same restaurant, but it turned out they weren't even close. They were off at some other place. My dad took the kid back to her parents and told them not to let that clown anywhere near their kids ever again. He told them what the clown had tried to do to my cousin as well. I was kind of freaked out. thinking that this clown is probably a pedophile. So this happened a year ago, and I'm still pretty shaken up by this whole event. I thought I'd share my story. I live in the UK, and in autumn it gets dark at around 4 p.m. There was a school autumn break that week, so all the kids were at home. That means my girlfriend's brother was home too. I'd been with her for a year at that point, so her family knew me pretty well, and her brother enjoyed my company. Recently, she'd been pretty stressed out. Her parents were going out across the country for the day, so she had to look after her brother. I thought that I'd give her a day to herself, so she could just kind of cool off. I asked her parents if I could look after their son for the day instead, and they readily agreed. So, I came in around 8 a.m., and they let me in before they set off. My girlfriend's brother woke up about an hour later, and she followed shortly afterwards. We went out for breakfast at a local cafe together, and went back to her house when we were done, and once I dropped her off, I took her brother with me to the park. We got there at around 2 p.m., and the place was pretty packed at that time. Eventually, though, the sun started to go down, and the place was completely emptied by 4 p.m. I texted my girlfriend and told her we'd be home in just a bit. She said okay. I'm gonna be honest, I completely lost track of time. Her brother and I were having a lot of fun being the only two in the park. Her brother and I were stood up on top of this really tall climbing frame with a slide on it. It was almost pitch black at this point, so I was just standing up there using my phone as a flashlight. A notification popped up on my screen. It was my girlfriend asking where we were. I responded, "Oh, I totally forgot. I'm coming home now." I told her brother we had to go. He sighed and asked if we could go down the slide, and I said yes. Before I went down, I knew what the park looked like. There were streetlights all around it, benches everywhere, some trees, and places for the kids to play. When I came out of the slide, though, there was something weird. A man had appeared out of nowhere and was stood directly beneath one of the streetlights. He had a long trench coat on and a beanie hat. I immediately got my girlfriend's brother behind me and called out to the man in a friendly, "Hi there." I got a response. He started groaning. I noticed he was swaying back and forth within the light, and he had his mouth open, drooling with a blank look in his eyes. This man made me feel really fucking uneasy. I picked little bro up and kept checking on the man this entire time. There was an exit to my left that led to the path back home, so I left out that way and kept checking behind me every few seconds. The man was still just stood there. The path where the man was stood merges with a big main path if you just walk through some bushes, and so does the one I walked through as well. I was walking down the path for about 2 minutes, periodically checking behind me, and I had thought I was in the clear. I wasn't. I was on a straight stretch of path with lots of streetlights when I saw him again. He was stood beneath one, looking up at it, and he was playing with something in his hands. I looked closer and realized he was holding a fucking knife. I kept walking and walking, checking behind me incessantly. My girlfriend's little brother was so scared, he had his head tucked into my chest. I noticed that the man seemed to be moving to new streetlights whenever I turned around. Initially, I thought my eyes had been playing tricks on me, but I started counting them, and I realized 2 streetlights behind him had suddenly turned into 5. I could faintly hear the groaning noise, and he was occasionally letting out moans as well. I picked up the pace a bit and turned the corner, getting into the last stretch of street before I got to my girlfriend's house. That was when I heard him behind the row of bushes. That moaning noise sounded angry, and I heard his heavy footsteps bounding down the path. The man was fucking running. I immediately broke into a sprint, and didn't stop until I turned an alleyway at the front of the street and got behind my girlfriend's house. There's a big bush there, so I crouched down behind that and spammed her phone with messages to open the back gate. I hugged her brother close until she opened it for us and got us in quickly. It felt like years. I went to the front of the house and had confirmed that I'd managed to shake him. He was now in the street, circling where he'd last seen me, outside of the alleyway just moments ago. He was still moaning, and he had that knife in his hand still. He started angrily kicking people's bins over. I called the police immediately, but he was gone by the time they arrived, and as far as I know, they never found him. There was a similar incident near the area a few months ago I saw in a local Facebook group, but I don't think anything came of that either. Her parents thanked me for keeping their son safe, and didn't hold any ill will against me for the situation. He went back to normal pretty much the day afterwards, but unfortunately he still has nightmares about the event. When my country isn't in lockdown, I'm still allowed to look after him with my girlfriend, funnily enough. But we haven't been to that park ever since, and I still check over my shoulder and break into a cold sweat every time I'm alone in the street. My mother and I were driving through our small town in southwest Virginia. My mother and father are divorced, and he lived in Tennessee. This is relevant to a story I've posted before, but not necessarily to this one. Anyways, they had very different viewpoints on helping out hitchhikers, as my dad was very much into hiking, camping, etc. But there was a woman walking down the road. Mind you, it's very hot outside. It was the summertime, and I noticed she was carrying a child swaddled up in a blanket, which struck me as a poor choice, considering it was right in the middle of summer, and it just seemed way too warm for a swaddle. And considering it was right in the middle of summer, and it just seemed way too warm for a swaddle. So I said to my mom, "We really need to pick that woman up. Surely she isn't far from where she needs to go, but she has a baby." And to my surprise, my mom pulled into the gas station parking lot and told me to go in and get a large bottle of water, and we would ask her if she would like a ride. So we pull out of the gas station and approach the thin, almost sickly-looking woman. She very quietly just grabbed the door handle and got inside, not even saying anything at all, not even a thank you, which really didn't sit right with me. This was the South. Everyone is friendly and approachable, for the most part. We ask where she's heading to, and me being in the passenger seat, I turned to look at her. She was looking down at her baby and cooing at it. She replied without ever looking up from the swaddled being. About 2 miles past the Dollar General on Jeb Stewart. We were very close to that area. I decided to turn and speak to the woman and maybe try and get a little conversation going, but as I got a better look at her baby, I noticed it was actually a drywall hammer wrapped up in a blanket inside of another blanket. I froze. It was like I had just walked into a deep freezer. I told my mom that I think we should really stop because I heard what sounded like knocking and was very adamant we needed to stop at the upcoming Dollar General. As we pulled in, I told my mom to get out of the car and that I needed her help locating the noise. We met each other at the hood of the car, where I told her, "Mom, that's not a baby. She has a hammer in that blanket." My mother advised me that we should walk inside to see if they had anything to help close that up. She told the woman we would be right back. We walked inside and told them to call the police so that they could help this woman. We could no longer have her in our vehicle, and explained why. My mom gave her some vague reason as to why we couldn't take her further, and she just got out very angrily, but almost confused. We left her behind in the parking lot. She very well could have just been a really confused woman, maybe someone with some mental issues. I don't know what was going on with her, but I do know that I don't think she had good intentions for us. So, to the lady with the drywall hammer, let's not meet again.